Why police prefer drug raids over investigating violent crimes. Arrest.png. 41 comments. Tags legal system. 08/03/2017 Ryan McMakin. Last year, I reported on a case in which the Johnson County Sheriff's Office in Kansas had raided the home of a law-abiding, middle-class family in Kansas. The officers, arrayed in SWAT gear, terrorized the family and searched the house for hours, failing to find anything criminal. The raid was the result of a program used by the sheriff's office in which the police spend hours staking out gardening centers, identifying shoppers who buy hydroponic gardening equipment, and then proceeding to conduct SWAT raids on the homes of the alleged perpetrators who are assumed to be growing marijuana in their homes. The victims of this particular raid, Bob and Addie Hart, sued in federal court. Last week, a federal appeals court overturned the district court's dismissal of the case and denounced the Johnson County government for relying on police work that amounted to little more than junk science, an incompetent investigation, and a publicity stunt. The Harts now plan to continue with their suit in which they seek $7 million in damages. The problem of police priorities. Viewing the antics of the Johnson County commissioners and the sheriff's office, one fairly quickly begins to wonder, does law enforcement in Johnson County really have nothing better to do? After all, if they have the time and resources to sit around in gardening center parking lots, engage in SWAT raids of suspected pot growers, and then conduct press conferences bragging about it, there must be virtually no crime at all in Johnson County. That, of course, is not the case. In an analysis I conducted of crime and arrests in Johnson County, I found that while Johnson County is generally pretty safe, an enormous amount of police activity conducted by the sheriff's office focused on drug enforcement, while real crime like assault, rape, and car thefts produced very few arrests. Johnson County, however, is hardly unique in its oversized interest in drug busts at the expense of investigating real crime. In Oak Park, Michigan, police agencies and prosecutors are apparently more interested in throwing the book at people for growing vegetables in their front yard instead of going after criminals who engage in real violent or property crime. The case of Julie Bass in Oak Park made national headlines when the city attempted to jail her for more than 90 days because she grew peppers in her front yard. After the city government was humiliated in the national media, prosecutors eventually dropped the charges. At the same time, the Oak Park police spent time raiding medicinal marijuana dispensaries and seizing drugs and cash in an apparent attempt to pad the department's budget through civil asset forfeiture. Given the enthusiasm with which the city goes after people who grow the wrong plants on their own property, many might be led to guess that Oak Park is relatively crime-free. And they would be quite wrong. Oak Park, it turns out, is a relatively high-crime area. In 2011, the same year the city was harassing Bass, Oak Park reported some of the worst violent crime rates among Michigan municipalities. According to FBI crime data, Oak Park had the 38th worst rate of violent crime out of a total of 338 towns and cities in Michigan. If we look throughout the nation, we find cases of police departments expending police time and resources to arrest people for having drywall in their cars, alleged to be cocaine, selling lemonade, or giving away free books. Sometimes, it's not even enough to harass peaceful citizens for these tiny infractions. The police have to invent the infractions. In Baltimore, for example, 2 separate cases of police apparently planting evidence have surfaced in the past month alone. The evidence against police is so damning, in fact, that the Baltimore prosecutor has already been forced to drop dozens of prosecutions that rely on testimony from the now discredited police officers. So, is Baltimore so free of violent crime that the police have nothing better to do than plant evidence that leads to small-time drug busts? Given that Baltimore has one of the highest homicide rates in the nation, the question need not even be asked. These police activities simply illustrate yet again how government police agencies have little interest in prioritizing the use of their resources so as to target real property crime and violent crime. In general, law enforcement agencies live in denial of the realities of opportunity cost and scarcity. Any police officer that is busy ticketing little girls for a lemonade stand is an officer that can't be investigating a real crime, or apprehending a suspect in a real crime. Any police officer that's spending hours searching vehicles for 1/10 of an ounce of marijuana is a police officer that's not patrolling a high-crime neighborhood for real crime. Police agencies often like to claim that they must enforce all the laws, but this is obviously nonsense. The fact that resources are scarce means that time and energy must be prioritized. The fact is police agencies like to prioritize the enforcement of piddling little non-crimes instead of focusing on stolen property and truly violent criminals. Why police prioritize so badly? There are numerous reasons why police tend to focus on certain types of law enforcement. Not all of them originate with the police agencies themselves. As Chris Calton has pointed out, the political system itself encourages overuse and uneconomical use of law enforcement resources. Legislators have an incentive to flood the courtrooms because if they want to get elected, they need to appear tough on crime. The product of this incentive is legislation geared toward continually creating newer infractions or criteria for arrest that signal to the voters that you, the politician, are going to clean up the streets. Naturally, the focus of these infractions tends to be on nonviolent crimes because the scope of violent crimes is narrower and has long been an established part of criminal law. But any new criteria for arrest means more people being funneled through the criminal justice system, and the costs are borne by the citizenry. A similar phenomenon exists with the prison system. Calton continues. Where legislators and police officers have inbuilt incentives to send as many people through the courts as possible, a similar incentive is faced by judges and prosecutors to send defendants through the prison system. Because all judges and prosecutors share common access to prison space with no individual cost for doing so, there is zero incentive for the limitation on the sentence sought by the individual prosecutor or handed down by the individual judge. There is, however, the incentive for these professions to win cases and appear tough on crime, respectively. The effect, as Bruce Benson and David Rasmussen tell us, is that prosecutors and judges as a group crowd the common access prisons much as cattle owners crowd common access grazing land. In other words, politicians have an incentive to expand the number of punishable infractions, and therefore they pave the way for police to lessen their focus on real crime. Having had their prerogatives greatly expanded beyond property crime and violent crime, police are only too happy to exploit this new status quo to benefit their own agencies. Thanks to the phenomenon of civil asset forfeiture greatly expanded by the drug war, police agencies can now profit financially from focusing on drug enforcement, more police searches, and by directing police resources away from the enforcement of other offenses. Police department finances benefit little from devoting police man-hours to busting car thieves or rapists. They can potentially pad their budgets significantly by seizing cash from suspected drug dealers without even having to go to trouble of gaining a criminal conviction first. Another factor is federal grants, which evaluate recipients based on arrests and not on reducing violent crime or property crime. The Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant, JAG, program, for example, is the largest nationwide criminal justice grant program. According to a report by the Brennan Center for Justice, the grant itself steers police departments away from investigating real crime. Current measures inadvertently incentivize unwise policy choices. Federal officials ask states to report the number of arrests, but not whether the crime rate dropped. They measure the amount of cocaine seized, but not whether arrestees were screened for drug addiction. These measures send a signal to states and localities that the federal government desires more arrests, more cocaine busts, and more prosecutions at the expense of other more effective activities. Radley Balco has pointed out that in some jurisdictions, spurred by these sorts of funding considerations, police may be actively attempting to downplay the importance of violence crime. Here's increasing evidence that the NYPD is paying less attention to violent crime. In an Explosive Village Voice series last year, current and former NYPD officers told the publication that supervising officers encouraged them to either downgrade or not even bother to file reports for assault, robbery, and even sexual assault. The theory is that the department faces political pressure to produce statistics showing that violent crime continues to drop. Since then, other New Yorkers have told The Voice that they have been rebuffed by NYPD when trying to report a crime. These perverse incentives also trickle down to the individual officer level. As explained by criminal justice research David Simon in this interview, police officers are rewarded in terms of both rank and pay by focusing on making large numbers of arrests for small infractions rather than going after a smaller number of truly dangerous criminals. This is certainly nothing new. As noted in this report from Harvard's Kennedy School, a significant proportion of today's police organizations seem to remain narrowly focused on the same categories of indicators that have dominated the field for decades. These criteria include numbers of arrests, citations or stop and frisk searches. This preoccupation with productivity, in the bureaucratic sense, dates back at least to the 1950s when there was an attempt to engage in more quantitative measures of police activity as opposed to qualitative. A 1975 study in criminal justice research identified one of the key problems with this approach. The emphasis too easily is put on rates of production, rather than on the quality of the process through which the rates are produced. The question, how many arrests or tickets, is asked rather than, was it wise to write a ticket, or make an arrest in this case? We are then left with a police workforce more interested in making arrests since that is what gets one promoted than on pursuing more difficult, higher quality activities. What to do about it? The first step to forcing police to prioritize real crime over nonviolent non-crime is to simply repeal laws that police use to justify ignoring real crime while focusing on drug crimes and other nonviolent offenses. Ending the drug war is always a good first step, of course. Also on the chopping block ought to be a host of other prohibitions, such as those on carrying certain types of knives. But police also need to be greatly limited in being the primary agency that enforces government regulations of activities such as front yard gardening and unlicensed lemonade sales. For centuries, alleged nuisances such as these were handled not by police citations and regulatory management, but through the civil law. If a front yard garden is truly a nuisance to neighbors, let those neighbors pursue the matter in civil court and prove they have endured damages as a result of the neighbors' gardening. If a temporary lemonade stand is truly damaging to the community, let the neighbors sue little girls in civil court. We'll then quickly find out just how much of a priority it really is for the community to stop the sale of unlicensed lemonade. Sending the police to enforce every little law against every little thing that mildly annoys us takes resources away from real crime with real costs in terms of property and human lives. After all, as Michael Giuliano has shown, the initiation of legal action by government agencies rather than by the victim is a modern innovation in the English-speaking world. Prior to this, police action was limited by the presence of an actual victim. Needless to say, during this period, lemonade stands or their 18th century equivalent were not a priority for law enforcement officials or anyone else. Ryan McMaken, at Ryan Macon, is the editor of Mises Wire and the Austrian. Send him your article submissions, but read article guidelines first. Ryan has degrees in economics and political science from the University of Colorado, and was the economist for the Colorado Division of Housing from 2009 to 2014. He is the author of Commie Cowboys, The Bourgeoisie and the Nation-State in the Western Genre.
Does the government work for us or do we work for the government? Tonight, what if the Constitution no longer applied? What if the whole purpose of the Constitution was to limit the government? What if Congress's enumerated powers in the Constitution no longer limited Congress, but were actually used as a justification to extend Congress's authority over every realm of human life? What if the president, meant to be an equal to Congress, has instead become a democratically elected, term-limited monarch? What if the president assumed that everything he did was legal just because he's the president? What if he could interrupt your regularly scheduled radio and TV programming for a special message from him? What if he could declare war on his own? What if he could read your emails and your texts without a search warrant? What if he could kill you without warning? What if Supreme Court justices no longer looked to the Constitution to determine the constitutionality of a law, but rather simply to what justices who preceded them thought about it? What if the rights and principles guaranteed in the Constitution have been so distorted in the past 200 years as to be unrecognizable by the founders? What if the 50 states were no longer sovereign entities, equals to each other, and parents of the federal government they voluntarily constituted? What if the states were mere provinces of a totally nationalized and fully centralized government? What if the Constitution was amended stealthily, not by constitutional amendments duly ratified by the states, but by the constant and persistent expansion of the federal government's role in our lives? What if the federal government decided if its own powers were proper and constitutional? What if the Constitution were no longer the supreme law of the land? What if you needed a license from the government to speak, to assemble, or to protest against the government? What if the government didn't like what you planned to say, and so it didn't give you the license? What if the right to keep and bear arms only applied to the government? What if posse comitatus, the federal law that prohibits our military from occupying our streets, were no longer in effect? What if the government considered the military an adequate dispenser of domestic law enforcement? What if cops looked and acted like troops and you couldn't distinguish the military from the police? What if you were not secure in your person, in your papers, and in your property? What if federal agents could write their own search warrants in defiance of the Constitution? What if the government could decide when you were and were not entitled to a jury trial? What if the government could take your property whenever it wanted? What if the government could continue prosecuting you until it got the verdict it wanted? What if the government could force you to testify against yourself simply by labeling you a domestic terrorist? What if the government could torture you until you said what the government wanted to hear? What if people running for president actually supported torture? What if the government tortured your children to get to you? What if government judges and government lawyers intimidated juries into convicting the innocent? What if the government could send you to your death and your innocence meant nothing so long as the government's procedures were followed? What if America's prison population, the largest in the world, was a cruel and unusual way for a country to be free? What if half the prison population never harmed anyone but themselves? What if the people had no rights except those the government chose to let them have? What if the states had no rights except to do as the federal government commanded? What if our elected officials didn't really live among us, but instead all had their hearts and homes in Washington, D.C.? What if the government could strip you of your rights because of where your mother was when you were born? What if the income tax was unconstitutional? What if the states were convinced to give up their representation in Congress? What if the government tried to ban you from using a substance in your body that is older than the government itself? What if voting didn't mean anything anymore because both political parties stand for big government? What if the government could write any law, regulate any behavior, and tax any event? The Constitution be damned. What if the government was the reason we don't have a Constitution anymore? What if you could love your country but hate what the government has done to it? What if sometimes to love your country you had to alter or abolish the government? What if Jefferson was right? What if that government is best which governs least? What if I'm right? What if the government is wrong? What if it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong? What if it is better to perish fighting for freedom than to live as a slave? What if freedom's greatest hour of danger is now?
Hey Charlotte County, this is Charlotte County COPWATCH, and I'd like to thank you for all your years of support through the years. As a result, this channel has grown and allowed me an equity partnership in carmarshal.com. Please take the time to check them out. They help you buy and sell your next car, even have a negotiating tool to save you from the hassle of haggling with multiple dealers. The link is in the description below. Please click and help support and give if you can too through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks again.